What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Monday, you know what time it is. It's time to go over the top waiver ads as we're heading into week 13. This will be the final week for most people before we hit the fantasy playoffs. It is a good idea to stack up on a defense that maybe you want to play the matchups on through the playoffs. Grab a handcuff for your top running back in case anything happens to them. You know you'll have a backup plan. To set your expectations for this waiver wire video, we do have a pretty good amount of players that can help you immediately. I will say the strength this week is definitely in running back. Tight end's a bit better than it was last week, but wide receiver is a bit lacking. When it comes to these running backs, a lot of the value though does come from the health of the running backs ahead of them. With injury information developing throughout the week, don't forget we will have updates for the waiver values on our website. Any massive changes in waiver value can be found there, and members of our website not only gain access to that information, you gain access to the rankings, sports betting picks, DFS picks, and more. So once again, that can be found at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. The link for that, as always, in the description box below. With that being said though, let's hop over to the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was heading into week 12, which quarterback currently led the league in red zone pass attempts. The correct answer was actually Tom Brady. Congratulations to Jace, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, we're shifting over to tight end, and let us know which tight end currently leads the league in end zone targets. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With that being said, let's hop over to the running backs. We have 6 on the list this week, and you'll notice the first running back we have is Devontae Booker of the Las Vegas Raiders. Booker is owned in about 5.5% of leagues, so definitely available for you guys out there. The big news in this one, of course, is the health of Josh Jacobs. Right now it's up in the air. He did get injured towards the end of the game. Since it was the end of the game, we didn't really get many updates on it. We don't know the severity of his issue, whether it will hold him out next week. But if it does, Devontae Booker will be in a prime position to succeed. Looking at Devontae Booker, we know that he's a versatile running back. We haven't really seen him pop off from an efficiency standpoint while he was either on the Raiders or for Denver, so the upside can be called into question, but we do know he is well versed in both the run game and the pass game. Believe it or not, he's had 1 or more receptions in 6 of his past 7 games for the Raiders. And with pass catching backs like Theo Riddick out since week 4 and Jalen Reagor not taking an offensive snap since week 10, the workload for Devontae Booker, if he is given the start in week 13, it's going to be massive. They face the New York Jets. The New York Jets, as we know, are going to be underdogs to nearly any team that they face. The Raiders should be no different, so this is a perfect example of a player you can grab off the waiver wires that you can plug and play into your lineup immediately after grabbing them. Speaking of banged up backfields, that's a good segue into our next player, which is James White of the New England Patriots. This is a player who's not as readily available as some of the other names on this list, but he is still available in over 50% of leagues, but that's probably going to be the last week we're able to grab him. He is, of course, coming off of a 2-touchdown performance. Before we get overly excited about that, though, we have to realize that a 2-touchdown performance in PPR leagues, the specialty of James White, he only posted 14.7 PPR points. Those 2 touchdowns equated for 12 of those points, so the typical high floor that we would expect from James White, we really didn't see it last week. After receiving 6 receptions in week 11 against Houston, he followed that up in week 12 against Arizona for 1 reception for a mere -1 receiving yard. You might be asking yourself why exactly that's important, and the reason it is to set your overall expectations if you're a James White owner or somebody considering grabbing him off the waivers. The James White with a high receiving floor that we've become accustomed to in an offense led by Tom Brady may not be exactly what we get from Cam Newton week by week. His floor may not exactly be that high, but we do know with the injuries sustained around this backfield, the opportunities for James White should be higher than they've been all season long. This now makes 2 games back to back that he's been able to produce starter level production, and we have no reason to believe that's going to be stopping anytime soon. The next 2 players we'll have, you'll notice that they are on the same team, so we can kind of bunch them both together. This is going to be Brian Hill and Ito Smith. Not everybody's waiver list is going to have Ito Smith as the running back ranked the highest. Brian Hill was heading into this week the presumed starter. Todd Gurley had a knee injury. The extent of the knee injury wasn't really known. We weren't given a bunch of details on it, but we did know he was ultimately ruled out. In the splits between the carries and the touches in this backfield between Brian Hill and Ito Smith, it was very similar. Ito Smith was given nearly 43% of the carries on the ground. Brian Hill edged him out with one additional carry, but the reason I have Ito Smith ranked the highest of both of these two running backs is the work in the receiving game. Ito Smith compiled 4 receptions, albeit for only 10 receiving yards, but when compared to Brian Hill didn't see a single reception on the game. It is also worth noting that while both rushers were efficient on the ground, Ito Smith did edge out Brian Hill in that area as well. So if I were to guess that heading into next week, if Todd Gurley doesn't play, Ito Smith is likely to see an increased opportunity share, and from what we've seen from him so far and throughout his career, an increased opportunity share for Ito Smith, we shouldn't expect anything less than a successful fantasy output. I did mention that when it comes to Todd Gurley, we aren't sure if he's going to play next week or not. That's part of the reason why these two running backs aren't ranked higher. The information we have is quite limited, likely to develop throughout the week. Considering Todd Gurley didn't practice at all last week, I wouldn't expect him to just completely reverse that and practice limited, maybe trending towards full by the tail end of the week. My personal opinion is that you'll likely have 1 to 2 more weeks of the ability to start either of these two running backs as the lead backs in this offense before Todd Gurley possibly returns. The next running back, I know it feels gross, it's Frank Gore of the New York Jets, but guys, we have to start to come to the realization that this is a workhorse running back that's available out there. La'Mical Perine, the running back that the New York Jets were trying to develop and play ahead of Frank Gore, he was placed on IR last Tuesday, and although you would think that they would try to bring in another talent at running back or develop somebody that they had further down the depth chart to battle for carries with Frank Gore, they really didn't do that. We saw a massive disparity in the touch totals between Frank Gore and the next running back behind him. Frank Gore received a massive 21 total touches this past week. Compare that to the next rusher behind him who only received 3. Now, it is fair criticism to bring up the fact that 21 total touches for Frank Gore only amounted to 11.6 points in PPR leagues, but still there is no reason to have any running back on the waiver wire that's getting 20 plus touches. That's possibly something we could expect moving forward. While I do think that 20 plus touches is by far on the high end, especially for such an aging running back like Frank Gore, despite that, I do still believe that Frank Gore will be receiving 70+% of the touches in this backfield for likely most, if not the remainder of the season. Right now, he's owned in sub 20% of leagues, so if you want to grab him, put him on your flex as a high floor option in a matchup where you don't feel your opponent is going to have a high amount of upside, that's probably a winning strategy and the best way to approach Frank Gore when putting him into your lineup. The final running back we have listed is a player that we have mentioned in previous waiver wire videos, but nobody that we believe has an immense amount of startability immediately after grabbing him. That player, of course, is Cam Akers of the LA Rams. Akers is coming off of a performance in which he was the most productive LA Rams rusher out of this backfield. I'll be the first to admit that most of his production did come off of one drive in which he found a lot of success, but believe me, the offensive coaching staff, they are going to realize the success that they had while Cam Akers was in may or may not have been a fluke. Cam Akers did ultimately finish the contest second when it comes to overall volume out of this backfield. His health has also been trending upward, and the success that he was able to show in this past contest is going to help him in getting an increased opportunity share moving forward. This is already a player that we would consider one injury away from having startability into your lineup, and with the other two running backs playing poorly, it may not even require an injury for that to come true. Alright guys, we're going to move over to wide receivers, and the first thing you'll probably notice when looking at this list is there are a lot of same names that we had listed last week. As you know, I'm not here to just list players that may have had one good game, a fluke game that I don't believe have season-long value. No, these are the players that I believe that you could use, you could trust in your lineup, and the overall expectation of their performances is going to be relatively safe and consistent week over week. To start this list, of course, we have Lazard, who's coming off of a really solid game since returning from injury, and it is now 100% safe to consider him the second target in this passing offense led by Aaron Rodgers. Devontae Adams, of course, is going to be the primary target in this passing offense, but Allen Lazard did appear to overtake the role of Marquez Valdes-Scantling, a player who was trending upward to his highest value prior to Allen Lazard coming in, so that just goes to show you exactly how much they value Allen Lazard and his involvement moving forward. In this past week's contest, Allen Lazard was the second highest targeted receiver by a wide margin. No other receiver really got heavy involvement outside of Adams and Lazard, and while 6 targets, 4 receptions may not seem like a lot, it did show a lot of promise seeing him reach the end zone, and we also can't discredit the fact that he found success against the Chicago Bears defense, one that was coming into this contest the second best at defending opposing fantasy receivers. The next player we have is Breshad Perriman of the New York Jets, and while Breshad Perriman didn't come out and have a complete stud game this week, he also didn't bust either. The New York Jets, for the second week in a row, played very poorly offensively, but Breshad Perriman was still able to notch in 8 targets. Believe it or not, 8 receiving targets has been his season high, so we are seeing him trending in the right direction when it comes to volume. And while yes, Denzel Mims, he is earning his spot and his role in the offense, Mims and his volume is not coming at the expense of Perriman. It appears that the expense is really coming out of Jamison Crowder. Crowder, of course, a high volume receiver, somebody that needs the 10 plus targets in order to produce wide receiver 2 numbers. When it comes to Perriman, when it comes to Mims, that's really just not the case. 8 targets for Breshad Perriman, if he's able to get that throughout the remainder of the season on average, he's going to completely dominate, because we can't forget that the New York Jets are playing from behind in nearly every game, and while Sam Darnold doesn't look good whatsoever, garbage time targets are still valuable targets for fantasy. The next receiver we have is Jalen Reagor of the Philadelphia Eagles. Now this is being recorded before the Monday night game, but I didn't want to leave him off this list because he is in a matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, and as we all know, the Seattle Seahawks give up the most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. Jalen Reagor is the lone receiver on the Philadelphia Eagles offense that has overall been trending upward since returning from injury, so depending on what the fantasy output is from Jalen Reagor, adjust your waiver rankings accordingly. If he has a really good game, you might want to bump him up on this list. If he posts a dud but sees heavy involvement, maybe you keep him where we have him ranked or drop him down a couple spots. We'll move into the next player though. The next receiver we have is Collin Johnson. He is of the Jacksonville Jaguars, and Mike Glennon did get the start this past week against the Cleveland Browns and found a lot of success offensively. A lot of the success offensively did fall on the back of Collin Johnson. We have that narrative of the backup to backup narrative, which historically has proven to be very fruitful for fantasy, but just for a limited amount of time. Typically, the backup to backup narrative only lasts for about 1 to 2 weeks. At this time, we're also not sure if Mike Glennon is going to be the starter next week or if they'll go back to Gardner Minshew, because there was the possibility that was left open heading into this matchup against Cleveland that Gardner Minshew would be available for the contest. If Gardner Minshew is available next week and Mike Glennon does return back to the bench, Collin Johnson is virtually unstartable. But with next week's matchup being against Minnesota, if Mike Glennon is starting, players like DJ Chark, Chris Conley, and D.D. Westbrook are all out, then I could certainly see Collin Johnson being a player you consider as a high-risk flex play. The final receiver we have is Bisi Johnson of the Minnesota Vikings, and this is definitely going to be a short-term rental and heavily reliant on the fact if Adam Thielen plays next week or not. Bisi Johnson was a common name to follow throughout this offseason. There was always positive reports surrounding his name, so it should surprise nobody that when he did step in and get an opportunity, he looked pretty darn good doing it. His 7 targets, he caught all of them, 7 receptions, 74 yards, and while he didn't score, heading into next week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, a defense that's actually weaker than the defense they faced this past week against Carolina, there could be an equal amount of opportunity for him heading into this week. Like I said though, all of this is heavily reliant on the health of Adam Thielen. Really, we know that the passing volume is on the low end of the league when it comes to Minnesota, who prefers to run the ball. And with Adam Thielen being out on the reserve COVID list and not out with injury, we can expect that if Adam Thielen does come back, he'll be a full go to play and perform. In that scenario, Bisi Johnson will hold 0 value, but once again, if Adam Thielen is out, Bisi Johnson could be a player you consider in a desperate situation. Alright guys, we're moving over to tight end, and I think we all can be thankful that Dallas Goedert for the 12th week in a row isn't going to be leading this list. After a mini celebration for that, we can come back to reality and realize there really really aren't any solid options at TE off the waivers this week. Leading this list is Dalton Schultz. While his ownership is low, he's likely to remain on this list, and the reason for that is strictly because of volume. Dalton Schultz has averaged nearly 7 targets per game over the past 4 weeks, and while he did see a 4-week low on Thanksgiving with 5 targets, he did convert all 5 of those targets into receptions, and the week before that he even found pay dirt. Overall, he's getting it done in every area when asked upon. The offense is really the only thing holding him back, but with last week being a tough matchup offensively against a really stingy Washington defense, the odds are better games are likely ahead for him. The next tight end we have is Drew Sample of the Cincinnati Bengals. This is the first name that has re-emerged as a possible tight end to grab off of the waiver wire. Initially, we saw him rise up to fame when CJ Uzomah was placed on the IR. Now at this point, Joe Burrow has unfortunately been placed on IR, and the backup quarterback, Brandon Allen, was keen to targeting Drew Sample. Drew Sample finished second on this team in targets with just 1 target behind Tyler Boyd, the same amount of targets as T. Higgins, and more targets than both AJ Green and Auden Tate, which bodes very positive for his potential role moving forward. As we know, the Cincinnati Bengals defense is pretty weak, and with the backup QB starting, it's likely that in the third and the fourth quarter, they are to be trailing, which is another factor that could boost the potential production and expectation for a player like Drew Sample. The next tight end we have is Logan Thomas of the Washington football team, a familiar name here, and yes, I did add him not just because he produced, but because quietly he has been producing. No, his volume hasn't been extremely high since the beginning part of the season, but after this week, he is pushing top 12 numbers at the tight end position. A lot of people are going to be looking at his schedule for the remainder of the season and through the fantasy playoffs and get scared. There are defenses like Pittsburgh, Carolina, San Francisco that he faces, but although those defenses are scary on paper, they have been very susceptible to being beaten by the tight end position in the past. Logan Thomas, he's definitely a player that can come in and produce and perform, and with the success that he's found early with Alex Smith, his involvement does have the potential to increase moving forward. Moving into the final tight end we have, and once again it is Jordan Reed of the San Francisco 49ers. At this point, we don't know exactly when George Kittle will return, and until he does, Jordan Reed is going to be a name thrown out there for a potential streaming option. Yes, the results that we were expecting on the field didn't necessarily come to fruition, but we do have to consider that although he did get 2 receptions on the game, he had 6 targets. 6 targets was actually good for second on the team from a receiver standpoint. Deebo Samuel got a whopping 13, but behind him, Jordan Reed saw heavy involvement. It didn't necessarily translate to production, but if he is receiving the second highest amount of targets on that team, and that trend does continue moving forward, Jordan Reed is going to be very valuable until George Kittle returns. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.